So, at what point does cryonics move from personal choice or to something that raises broader ethical questions and obligations? And with us, and we are joined by Francesca Minerva, Associate Professor of Moral Philosophy. She's joining us digitally from Milan. And Ole Martin Moen, Professor of Philosophy at Oslo Met. Ole, how do you respond to cryonic? Does cryonics challenge existing ethical boundaries in a meaningful way? Is it just a funeral or something else?
First, thank you very much. And hi, Francesca. Nice talking to you. And first, full disclosure, I'm signed up for cryopreservation at Alcor. I have no other ties to Alcor than that, though that might be a pretty big tie. Good. So there are, as we've already seen, lots and lots of questions that are opened up when we're discussing cryonics and bioethics. And one question that has come up today is the question of what it takes to be dead and what it takes to be dead in different senses. And if we focus now on legal death, there's the question of do you need to be declared legally dead before cryopreservation can start, or could this be done, at one and the same time? Francesca has called this cryothanasia. I have called it cryocide. Um, could this be combined in a way? But then Göran Hermeren said that given Sweden's definition of death legally, it seems cryonics wouldn't be possible. But I beg to disagree, because isn't there also an option that is that the patient, as you at Alcor call them, that they are actually not declared dead at all, where they continue to be alive legally, although in a cryopreserved state? That seems to me, in one sense, like the obvious option and the honest option, given the way that we think and talk about cryonics. Of course, that's there are challenges there, for example, with life insurance. But insofar as those of us who think cryonics might work think that this is a way to extend one's life, I think we should explore the option of uh, of having a policy in place where one is actually not declared dead at all, and that also gives persons a lot more autonomy over what should happen with them. So that's like one point. And if I may share my other point as well, is that I think that's more of a policy or a culture issue, but I think it's extremely important to prevent a social and cultural backlash against cryonics. There could be some scandal, some bad agent doing something scandalous, and that could create a lot of harm, could create a lot of impulse legislation. So I think that's a hugely important area to work in. And I think the kind of work that you're doing in, for example, preparing for and making it possible for grieving parents, for example, to be there in a meaningful way. I think those kinds of things they're a buffer against this moral outrage that one could imagine be triggered by this, because it's a topic that very easily causes sensation that the media loves. At least that's my impression. It's quirky and funny and serious, so it can gather a lot of attention, and that can be used for good, that attention, but it can also be used in very harmful ways, and it's super important to prevent that from happening. So those are like my two initial thoughts here.
Thank you, Ola. Francesca, in what follows in terms of how we define acceptable forms of experimental or end of life interventions? We've already talked about some forms of it. What is your take?
Yes, I agree with Ulla Martin about yeah. So he has written a paper about cryocide, and then Anders Anders and I wrote a paper on what we call cryoeuthanasia. But I think we have like similar views. One of the problems now with euthanasia is that if somebody has terminal condition, say they have like brain cancer, so something that really affects their brain, which is what we really want to preserve when we do cryonics, cryopreservation, and they know their brain is going to be damaged, or Alzheimer's disease, other condition that really affect the brain, then it's not really possible to reach the point where they can be cryopreserved before the damage to their brain has gone too far. Now, a few countries in the world allow assisted suicide and euthanasia, but that's a minority of countries. But we can see how in these cases, or even just like against normal aging, like there is a point where probably like the brain stops, it's not really in the great shape it used to be before. I don't know after which age, say 90, 100, but some point one could say, okay, I really want to invest the last few 2-3 years, like I want to preserve what I have now, but we can't really do it because there are like legal constraints where euthanasia is illegal. But the main objection to euthanasia is based on the idea that you want to accelerate the death, like you want to cause the death of the patient. But when you do cryonics with the goal of when you do cryonics, you actually want to extend the life of the patient. That the goal is not really to kill them. So what we call cryoeuthanasia or cryocide is the idea that we should be allowed to practice euthanasia, so like cause legal death in advance before the person is killed by disease, in the hope that they can live much longer in the future. But here, all the traditional objections to euthanasia don't really work, because the point is that you cannot you cannot accelerate death, you should not cause death. But the point is that when you practice cryoeuthanasia, cryocides, that's not your goal. So maybe we need some legal change in that respect. So to allow cryoeuthanasia even in countries where euthanasia is not legal. This is my point on your specific question in this respect. I don't know if you want me to go on something else, on other aspects.
Ola?
Yep. Thank you. I agree wholeheartedly about this point that at least one of the major objections to assisted suicide or euthanasia is intentionally causing death. And that is not the case. You don't do that, as you say, Francesca, in the case of cryoeuthanasia, if that becomes a thing. Although here, this also borders on the topic that I brought up initially about whether you need to be declared dead at all in order to be cryopreserved, or if this is something that you can do while you're still alive. That has, in that case, it has in common with cryoeuthanasia that you're actually not aiming for death, but you're in fact not crossing. You're not. It's not just that you don't intend crossing that boundary, but you also actually don't causally bring it about, because you remain alive, albeit in this frozen state. I don't know. Do you have any? Do you think that could be a viable way forward, Francesca?
Yes, I agree. This could be another option. So we don't get to the point where the person has to be legally declared dead. So now I think the legislation about cryonics is that before you can start with cryonics, one has to be considered legally dead, and so there's not much room. But if we could change that, obviously we could also skip this thing altogether. Now I don't know for technical, so but somebody else was like more an expert, like do you need, obviously you need at some point the the heart to stop beating, so in a sense, after a while technically the person could be considered legally dead. But I agree that we could change that kind of frame to allow this kind of intervention when a person wants to have it, because we really have a lot of focus on autonomy, um, in bioethics, but like legislation in general. There's been a big change of paradigm in the approach of doctors to their patients. So there is way more emphasis on respecting the patient's autonomy. But this doesn't seem to affect cryonics in some respects. So that's still considered not matter where somebody can exercise their autonomy as a patient, which is bizarre.
Quite interesting, Ole. Do you think about autonomy? Has that changed, as Francesca puts up?
Yes, one of the major changes in medical law and what's well regarded medical practice over the last 40 to 50 years is the much larger emphasis on informed consent, that as a rule that needs to be respected. And so and then and that of course borders on the question of whether you should be allowed to be cryopreserved at all. And of course it's an open question whether cryonics works, but insofar as the alternatives have an even lesser chance of working, like burial or cremation, it seems it could still be a rational choice, as we have both argued. Though one question that I think needs to be addressed is how we frame this, what kind of intervention we consider this to be. Anders touched on this issue. Is this a medical procedure, or is it more of a personal choice, something bordering on or that derives from one's worldview or religion, if you may? I'm wondering which of those paths we should go, and if we have to choose. In some ways, it's easier to go the religion pathway because we respect people's religious choices, sometimes in even absurd ways. And it's quite the hurdle to for cryonics to meet medical criteria for what is proven effective, for example. Though, so in one sense, and this has to do with the far future, it has to do with some of our fundamental values. So in a sense, it has to do with one's worldview as much as it has to do with medicine and technicalities there. I don't know if you, Francesca, have any thoughts on that issue. Should we think of this as a personal choice or as medicine, or can we be in both camps at the same time?
Francesca?
Yeah, so my view is that it should be seen as a sort of experimental treatment. So it's a treatment that we don't know exactly how it's going to work, if it's going to work, but you can try it, right? People can try all sorts of experimental treatments. The thing that is really interesting to me as well is that it's true that, as you were saying, we don't know if cryonics is going to work, and maybe the chances of succeeding are very, very small. But what is interesting that then the outcome could be the best outcomes in terms of quality just life of years of any treatment. We spent millions of dollars or euros of in treatments that buy just a few years of life for a patient. And but this could be like a treatment that, if it works eventually, can buy hundreds of years. And there is nothing like that, like no other treatment, intensive care unit, you name it. Even like on very young children, they can buy like 80 years, 90 years, but like hundreds or thousands of years, that doesn't exist. That's not like the prospect of any other treatment. So I think we should see it as an experimental treatment that people should have a right to try. And that brings me to like another implication, that maybe we need to invest more public money on research on cryonics, because of the potential like huge outcome in terms of qualities that we could get from it. I don't know if you agree on this.
Ole, do you agree on public funding for cryonics?
Sure. I think that's a good idea. And I think that within, as Francesca says here, within the standard framework that we use for allocating medical resources, the quality system. So you try to figure out how many quality adjusted life years can you get from a certain intervention. That really just means how much life quality, so how much life quality could we get? And of course, there's this Pascal's wager-like situation with cryonics, where there is potentially a very huge upside, but it's difficult to calculate like how big that upside is. Though when it comes to the question of funding, I think that also relates to public perception of cryonics, and whether there is some hazardous decision made or claim made by someone who is seen to represent the cryonics community or whoever is interested in cryonics. And I'm wondering also if one of the hazard risks is us philosophers. Because when we use cryonics as like a prism, or as Anders said it, or as the basis for various thought experiments and various perhaps radical or counterintuitive ideas about life and death, could this be a problem and a real hazard for cryonics as a social and cultural phenomenon? I don't know if that's the case, but I hope that Alcor will tell me if our discussions are creating a lot more problems than they are solving. Though, because as philosophers, that's really not our concern. We want to figure out where the arguments lead, and we want to pursue an argument even if it's very speculative, and that doesn't really take into account like the PR perspective. So then the question becomes, how can we, if we're still going to do that, how can we distance ourselves publicly from being identified as like spokespersons for this practice? Because if that places limitations on what we can say professionally, then that's a challenge. Do you agree that actually we might be the hazard here?
Yes, I mean, controversial ideas and stuff. So yes, I agree that maybe philosophers promote like bad PR. I think a lot of people really have still this kind of like disgust, like gut reaction, like yuck reaction to the idea of cryonics, right? I see this especially like with my students when we talk about cryonics. It's like, oh, it's so gross. Like you can only, like the idea that one can cryopreserve only their heads, or the idea that then you don't come back with your whole body, but your brain is uploaded on a different substrate which is not even carbon based, so maybe on a computer. It really makes people have this yak reaction, which is really deep, not very rational. And perhaps the fact that we drag, like we see all the potential of cryonics, or like, oh, could we start once we upload the brain, can we multiply, make copies, can we put together different brains? so these are all like mental experiments or like discussions that it's fun to have as philosophers. But maybe, as you say, can put people off in a way. It's difficult though, because I always think that, philosophy has to arrive before science. Somebody was mentioning before in the the case of cloning, when cloning became practically, it was Anders actually, when cloning became practically feasible, the legislation, but even the ethical debate wasn't ready. And so we ended up with very bad legislations. So I think that, the ethical and the legal analysis needs to arrive before things are feasible on a practical level. So that's still an open question for me, but I see your point in that. Yeah.
Francesca, Ola, thank you very much. We have to move on with the program, and perhaps we're going to talk more about the science, about longevity. So I welcome back Anders Sandberg. And we are joined in by João Pedro de Magalhães, professor of molecular biogerontology at the University of Birmingham, joining us digitally. So, let me start with this. If we take seriously this, the possibility of extended lifespan, how does cryonics fit into this broader trajectory? João, what do you think from a biological perspective? Where does cryonics sit in relation to current longevity research?
Well, thank you. Thank you for the invitation. And so, in answer to your question, I suppose, I'm a biologist and I work on the biology of aging and longevity. And what we are trying to do is to understand aging process and develop interventions that allow people to live longer, healthier lives. I think the problem is that biology is really, really complicated. And so progress in longevity and developing interventions for longevity progresses very, very slowly. So to give one example, I usually quote the biggest life-extending intervention we have in mammals is caloric restriction. And caloric restriction was discovered over 90 years ago in the 1930s at Cornell University. So the best we can do in terms of longevity interventions in mammals dates 90 years ago. So that's the problem, is that longevity interventions evolve very slowly. And so the way cryopreservation, you could argue that cryopreservation is a longevity technology in terms of, from different levels, at the level of things like organ banking, which can save lives and can improve life expectancy of patients. And then focusing more on cryonics, the way I see it is that it could be seen as a bridge to a future where people no longer have to age. Because at the moment, everybody ages and everybody will inevitably die within a relatively short time scale. At least I consider it a short time scale, the current human lifespan. And so we can think of cryonics as a bridge to a future where humans would live much, much longer. So if we could ablate aging, if we could, with technology, cure aging, people would be living thousands of years. And so that's the future. Personally, I would like to live in, and cryonics could be a bridge to that future.
Well, Anders, speaking of bridges, you mentioned in your keynote institutions, systems. What kind of systems would need to be adapted for such longevity trajectories to become possible?
So, so right now, I think the longevity situation is we have academic research trying to understand what is actually going on in aging. Adjoining that is people trying to make the transition in turning that into actual treatments. And then we have a healthcare system that is doing the normal stuff, the things that are already established, and quite often not regarding aging even as a disease or at least a condition needing any treatment. And then we have a regulatory system that's very strongly attached to the current healthcare system and its assumptions about what is the condition that needs treatment or not. And that is, of course, limiting the amount of research you can do on aging, or at least doing clinical trials, because getting a medication against aging, that it's not a disease. Hence, you cannot really do a proper clinical trial, which kind of slows this. So the obvious part of the wish list would be, if we started regarding aging actually as something that can be partially treated, and it's an underlying cause for a lot of bad things like age-related diseases. And even if we regard life extension as the pie in the sky, we might still say, yeah, but slowing down those aging processes, that works in the lab. We have good reasons to want that because that's going to reduce diabetes, Alzheimer, cancer, cardiovascular, etc., etc. This is valuable to change the policies for and move on. And of course, you have a lot of entrepreneurs in the transitional state that really would like that to happen because maybe, just maybe, they could get very rich from that. I wonder if there's something else about the institutions here. Part of that is, of course, the understanding that aging is something that you can affect and modify. And that is a relatively recent discovery. It's kind of mid to late 1990s. And that has not percolated into the society very much. We certainly have our stories and images and myths about longevity elixirs. But the fact that you can actually do a genetic modification or use a small molecule and get at least the lab animals to live significantly longer, that has not percolated very far. And I expect that sooner or later there's going to be a moment when that actually happens. And that's going to be a kind of cultural shift, not so much institutional shift, but a cultural shift that's probably going to change things. Joao, do you agree with that assessment, or do you think I'm totally barking up the wrong institutional tree?
No, I agree with you. I think we need a shift in how we approach aging. In other words, at the moment we are more reactive. And we reactive mostly to age-related diseases. We try to treat age-related diseases. In terms of prevention of aging and multimorbidity and age-related diseases, I mean, what we do at the moment is, like my mother's advice, exercise, eat healthy, don't smoke, don't drink too much. I mean, that's still the best advice we have. I think there's an institutional problem, but there's also a scientific or technological problem, however, which is if someone comes to me and says, okay, listen, what do you do for your longevity? I say exercise, don't smoke, don't drink too much alcohol, healthy diet. I mean, I think that's the problem. We still don't have longevity intervention that's been proven in humans that will slow down the aging process. At the moment, there is no proven way of slowing down the human aging process, apart from eating well, exercise, apart the boring lifestyles choices. So I think there's a cultural and institutional issue, but in my view, that is from a scientific and technological restriction or lack of progress in the field. And I think that's a big problem I think we have in the field of aging. And that's why a lot of other fields, even though the field of aging has been growing and there's more companies trying to develop those interventions, still a lot of other fields don't take us seriously because we still don't have something we can show as a success story. We still haven't had our Sputnik moment or our ChatGPT moment where we go, listen, this works, and then everyone else starts to do it. Like happened with ChatGPT or Sputnik or some of these truly transformative breakthroughs.
Anders, do you see a particular performative breakthrough in the field of cryonics longevity?
I think it depends a little bit on what you mean by breakthrough. It might be at Ozempic. It might be, if not the Sputnik movement, at least Goddard's rocket. It suddenly is a treatment that actually has pretty big effects that are getting widely used with apparently good effects, and is probably normalizing a lot of very preventative treatments that are akin, if not similar, to longevity treatment. But yeah, we're still waiting for any good evidence, even for something as simple as metformin. We're still waiting for the TAME trial to figure out, does this actually help healthy humans? And that ought to have been the simplest thing ever to do. But even that has been harder to get funding for. I can imagine that you get that Sputnik moment when you revive a mouse. That's an obvious thing. You could imagine that you have some molecule that shows a very strong effect. But I think the real Sputnik moments always are a demonstration of a technology which might actually not be particularly ready for actual use. Dolly the sheep was just the start of cloning livestock. It took many years before people got good at that, but it caused a big social reaction. Sputnik was a triumph, but there had been a fair bit of rockets before that didn't make a splash. But once you make a splash, you make something real. I think there's both a scientific understanding and a cultural understanding, and the institutions that suddenly pile in and realize, oh, we need to do something. Sometimes that's very bad, as we discussed with bad law, but sometimes it's also, oh, we can pile in and actually start helping, or we can remove blockers that are kind of obvious in retrospect and now look stupid. I would imagine that if there was some good success with a longevity treatment, suddenly a lot of the blockers for the clinical trials would suddenly disappear.
Do you see any particular hurdles, Pedro, for the current development in the
yes,
field?
I mean, I think in aging and longevity, there's some big hurdles. Unfortunately, I mean, I think at the biological level, there's a big hurdle that we actually don't understand why we age. I mean, we have a number of theories, DNA damage, oxidative damage, telomeres, genetic programs. There's a lot of theories, but biology is really, really complicated, and we can't really, do experiments in humans, just particularly in aging, that takes a long time. So, I mean, when you look at diseases, specific age-related diseases, well, some of them we understand well. I think we have a fairly good understanding, at least conceptual understanding of cancer, but we don't have a good understanding of Alzheimer's disease, for example, because it's so complicated. And even though there's billions of dollars to Alzheimer's per year, we still don't have a good understanding. And then it's difficult to do trials, as Anders was alluding to the TAME trial, which is done by, well, they're trying to do it. They've been trying to do it for 15 years, and it, to my knowledge, hasn't started yet, which is a metformin trial in humans, because it's expensive and it takes a long time. So to do an aging trial in human beings is very time consuming and very, very expensive. We're talking hundreds of millions of dollars. So those are the big hurdles about advancing the longevity aging fields. So one of the things that actually, Anders briefly touched upon that I think is quite important is that I see a Sputnik or Dolly the sheep moment much more rapidly happening in cryopreservation, like bringing back to life a cryopreserved mouse or rat. I mean, there's this CryoRat project from in the US, as you may be aware of. So I see that happening much sooner than such a moment in aging or longevity, because it's much easier to do those experiments in cryopreservation than it is to do them in aging or longevity, which, well, we can do some experiments in animals, but we've extended lifespan in animals for decades, since the 1930s with caloric restriction. But yet translating that to humans is still a big challenge. So we can do that much quicker, I think, in cryopreservation.
I think there is also something interesting about cryonics being a little bit more of engineering than science. So there is often this conflation we tend to do of engineering and science, because both use very much the same language, the same mathematics, the same types of solutions. Except that science is, of course, trying to efficiently gather knowledge about things, while engineering is trying to do something. And the interesting part about cryonics is that you do interventions that are not natural. It's very, very different from the natural environment of a person that is being cryopreserved. And you can start adding cryopreservation fluids. You can say, let's add ferrite nanoparticles, so maybe we can use microwaves to heat the tissue better. You can do all sorts of things that are very different from biology. While in longevity, you want to intervene with this complex system, and you're not normally allowed to re-engineer it particularly deeply. Yes, we might want to add some drug or stem cell, or do even some genetic engineering, but we can do much less engineering. We're much more stuck in figuring things out in the scientific mode.
No, absolutely. Yes. And we have good endpoints in cryopreservation. I mean, if you're cryopreserving cells, okay, you can tell whether the cells are alive or dead. It's very objective. If you're cryopreserving an animal, you can tell where it lives or die, or even tell what percentage of its cells after the procedure are alive or dead. So, you have good endpoints. You can design experiments. It's a proper engineering problem, I think, cryopreservation, because you know what you have to do. You know what the endpoint is. Aging and longevity is much more complicated. I mean, you cannot do a lifespan study lasting decades, right? So we have like biomarkers of aging, but what exactly do they mean? We don't understand well. And of course, we cannot re-engineer human biology. So it's much more complicated problem tackling aging or longevity than tackling cryopreservation.
Quite interesting. Anders, do you have something to add?
Well, I think it's an interesting question whether you can cut out the complexity of a problem. And again, a lot of good engineering consists of ignoring something super complex and making a simple but robust solution. Quite often, you can try to use finite element calculations to really calculate the strength of a cable or a beam. But then you multiply by 3 to make sure that, yep, whatever my calculation errors were, I'm definitely on the safe side. And I think we have a problem in science that we quite often try to be as exact and finicky as possible, which means that we don't have that range of robustness in our conclusion. So we end up with doing a lot of longevity research, but we should maybe be aiming at longevity engineering. But similarly, I think there is this interesting issue about doing the research that leads to good engineering, both in cryonics and longevity. For example, in Oxford, we had a chat about a small group of us wanted to kind of control water molecules on a microscale. Some were from mathematics, some from physics, some from chemistry. And I was there as an ethicist bringing up cryonics because we all realized that if we could just control ice formation on a microscale, that would be a super cool project. Pun unfortunately not intended, but we didn't get any funding for it, but I still think that would have been useful. Engineering ice, because ice is also important for a lot of other stuff. You can build a surprising amount of things out of ice. So there are other values. I think the engineering mindset, unfortunately, is something that's relatively rare among us academics. It's very rare among philosophers because philosophers generally are trying to understand things. We're rarely trying to change things. And given how some philosophers who actually have tried to change the world have affected it, it's maybe safest that we don't do it too much. But I do think we might need a bit more longevity engineering.
Okay. Thank you very much, Pedro, and thank you, Anders, for your interventions. And I would like to invite the speakers on stage. Yeah. So we now move into a joint discussion focusing on 3 policy challenges or opportunities: the legal definition of death, consumer protection, and institutional responsibility. I'd like to ask each of you to briefly comment on one of these. And, well, let's start with the legal definition of death. What becomes unclear or contested if cryonics is applied and offered as a service?
I guess I'm fine. Everybody's looking at me. First of all, I have to address the philosophy question and how it relates to this, actually, because it does. The euthanasia issue or question. You're killing me with this operationally, particularly in the United States, particularly in European countries that have a strong religious philosophy in the law. Here's why, right? Reality is when Alcor has been bedside, and I want to make very, very abundantly clear for all the media that we will not touch a body until a third party has declared them legally dead. I say that because our entire board was arrested for murder in the Dora Kent case in the 90s. And that was because the coroner did not understand that respiration was continued after death. We continue cardiopulmonary support. So they saw indicators of oxygen in the blood, and they arrested our board for murder. We never want that to happen again, okay? So what I want to say is, and your terminology, Francesca, I appreciate that you recognize that there's a visceral response to cryopreservation because it's associated with death. The problem when you say cryocide, and you're philosophers, I don't want to limit you. I think there's much more interesting philosophical questions about the prisoner's dilemma of keeping somebody alive to punish them later, by the way, things like that. Yeah, well, that's a philosophy question. But nonetheless, cryocide or cryonasia kills me. Okay. It's immediately it's immediately rejected in the legal sphere in the US. And it makes it incredibly difficult for me to operationally do anything. I prefer and suggest a new term, a cryocoma. And here's why. People are very used to a coma in the medical sense. And for people who say, oh, no, coma is not the same thing, we chemically induce comas right now. The only difference is engineering. And you made a great point. I forgot to mention, this is bioengineering, this biomechanical engineering that we're doing. That's the core of what we're doing. We're altering ice on a molecular structure, which is engineering. So please call it cryocoma. If we walk into a state and say cryoside, I'm sorry, I'm talking long, but I have to say this because it's so important. And when it comes to the definition of death, I will say there's a difference between the facts and the perception of death. When we do a cryopreservation right at the time of death, and we have been bedside on a euthanasia, not that we participated in, we do see objectively really good cryopreservation.
Quite interesting. Any comments on this from the other panelists?
Can I just, yes, I think you make a very interesting...
Please, Jessica.
Just like one thing, but do you think that people would agree to inducing coma on a perfectly healthy patient? Suppose somebody just had a diagnosis of brain cancer or Alzheimer, and then you say, well, we're not going to give you cryoeuthanasia or cryoside. We're just going to induce you into a comatose state and then cryopreserve you. I mean, I don't know if you would get more people on board just like that. I don't know. I mean, maybe...
Well, it's not dissimilar to the space application of this, which is if you go into distant space, the only modality we can think of right now is to cryopreserve you. You see it in the movies, right? Han Solo. So I think in that sense, once there's the Sputnik moment, but there will be, and I'm telling you, I can't tell you things. There's things that I've seen, and the Sputnik moment I think will be kidneys, okay, or the mouse, one of those two, and it's closer than you think, and there may be indicators that are there. So the point is, when that happens, Francesca, I do think actually people will be very receptive if you, for instance, had a mouse that was revived, because now it's tangible. And now they say, you know what, it is better than this awful death of brain cancer that we see. And by the way, we do CT scans of brain cancer patients at Alcor. So we're actually getting molecular details never seen before in brain cancer. That's another application. So yes, I think we need a moment. But when it happens, it'll go.
Do you have a comment, Anders?
Yeah. Well, I already got one. I don't need another one. So, and now let's see if I can remember my very smart comment too. So one of I think Francesca and Ole are pointing at an interesting problem. The philosophical questions that are really great for a philosophy seminar are quite often radical. And if you're a good lecturer, you can really get your students riled up about something and then show that their intuitions are wrong. And that's great for philosophy. And that's usually bad PR. I think I agree on that. But we also tend to think mostly like this when it's remote, when it's not here, when it's about our mother, when it's about the pill we can actually go and buy in the drugstore. We think about it very differently. Now, in the replication crisis, construal theory in psychology is in trouble, but I think it's a general truth that we think very differently about remote things, abstract things, the future, rather than what I can get in the drugstore, rather than the treatment my doctor says, oh, we could do this. It might be painful, but it might work. Suddenly I think about it very differently. And that is where Sputnik moments might be very important, because you do a shift from, principles that I might apply big moral principles about cryonics and longevity and when they're theoretical, when they're in the philosophy discussion or the science fiction movie. If it's something I'm being offered in the hospital, I will think about it very differently. It becomes much more concrete. I'm starting to see the little nitty-gritty details, how it might interfere and fit with my personal life. And I think that is an important thing. And of course, in terms of being good in applied philosophy, we should probably try to see those frictions and see where we can contribute on that, besides the awesome, interesting theoretical stuff.
Professor Marian, you have a comment?
I would like to comment on the discussion of euthanasia, if I may, very briefly. I take as a starting point what Ulla said about informed consent and the personal choice. And I add to that the importance of not letting too long time go between the cryo people come and take care of me and the definition of death. Would then, given this, the ideal be that you commit suicide at the cryo clinic? Because then there will be very short time between your death and the cryo people taking care of your body. And there would be no problem with euthanasia because you make the decision yourself to kill yourself.
That's not how the lawyers and police will think about it.
We don't have to think like the lawyers or the policemen. We can think freely if we want.
Ola has a comment.
You don't think this was...
James, Ola has a comment too.
No, I have my own mic, but I have a mic. But yes, just you. It's a bit unclear to me if you object to the practice or to the label.
It's the label and verbiage.
It's just a label.
But well, okay. Let me be very careful. I need to be very careful here. I'm not going to personally judge anybody's decision in terms of how they live and end their life. It's not my job. We don't make those moral decisions at Alcor. We're a science lab. You need to be very careful. Okay. We cannot intervene. You're a philosopher. You can do that. You can sit there and discuss it all day long. There are very real consequences in terms of the advancement of the science. If I sit here and advocate for a position that I know culturally is considered reprehensible in my culture, okay, so I won't do it. Won't do it. Very serious consequences. This could be outlawed. All right. So we as an institution in Alcor operationally cannot advocate for any of it. However, my job is time to temperature, as Johan said. The absolute best results objectively, which I can prove scientifically because we do CT scans of the body and the brain very shortly after, as soon as we get the body, time to temperature, time to temperature, time to temperature. So I will be bedside, okay? If you say you've gone into a legally authorized clinic to go through a process that's legally allowed, I'm not going to judge you doing that. I'm not going to advocate for you doing it. But if you do it and you tell us, we will be there, okay? But yes, I agree with that scientifically because it's fact, it's true. But the verbiage is, please, it's so difficult on the political side. In part, I don't know if you know, but there's been a political shift in the U.S. recently. And it's gone a direction that if you talk about suicide or you talk about euthanasia, you will get us shut down. And not you, but like if that is a position that's largely taken in the journals and things like that. And listen, cryocoma is actually, like you said, and you're right on the philosophy side, that we're actually pro-life. Think about that. We're the ultimate pro-life. Okay. And by the way, it's 300 years. It's not immortality. 300 years is what you get, we know. So yeah.
James, let's move on. It's natural to move on to discussing patient protection, consumer protection, because this is biology. What can be said about these services? Someone that would like to take the ball on consumer protection, patient protection? The question is a comment on patient protection, consumer protection. How should we look at it? Because this is a service being offered, and making some claims about medicine, about biology. What can we comment about it? Is this a proper way forward? Is there some guardrails we should think about?
I think the experience of communication concerning climate crisis and concerning other difficult issues show that you don't fully appreciate the difficulty of getting the information and understanding it. And so there is a lot of work to do to make sure that those who you talk to understand what you want to say and what you offer them.
Because we get into legal contracts also. James, you had a comment on?
Very clear. This is a mistake that I think has been made in the past, and that I think even people associated with Alcor perhaps have made this mistake. Two things to be very clear. Okay, there's a legal contract. You're right. There's two laws that are operative here. One is anatomical gift for research. The other is a contract where we agree not to do any destructive testing and to hold your remains indefinitely. Okay, this is not immortality. And when people talked about that, it wrecked your credibility ab initio, for a legal term. Okay, we don't know what this is. And so for consumer protection, I think just like when, you know, the pharmaceutical commercials have all the disclaimers of this may cause death. Ironically, it's to heal you. But any event, we don't know how this works. You're part of a science experiment. So I make that very, very clear. We don't know if this will work, okay, at all. I'm the president of the premier organization. And if anybody else tells you from a for-profit or any other entity that you're going to, you know, this is going to work and you're going to live forever, they're wrong. It's bullshit.
So, Pedro,
that's the technical term. Bullshit.
Do you have a comment on the
be honest,
medical, biochemical side of cryonics? It is something that is up for research, where we don't understand many of the mechanisms you talked about, not understanding aging. Do we understand cryobiology?
So I think we have a conceptual understanding of cryobiology. We may not understand all of its effects on cells because, again, human biology, human cells are complicated, but we have a conceptual understanding of what we want to do. We want to lower the temperature without destroying the cells so that they can be cryopreserved for later. So I think from a biology and engineering perspective, our understanding is conceptually greater in terms of cryopreservation than our understanding of Alzheimer's disease or our understanding of type 2 diabetes or our understanding of the whole aging process. And that's a big advantage. And that's, as I said before, why I think advances in cryotechnology and cryopreservation are, in my view, easier to achieve than advances in aging research. And from a public's perspective, obviously, you know, ultimately people don't want to die, even if cryopreservation is perfect, which is not at the moment, and it's a gamble. But they're obviously much more interested in longevity and anti-aging technologies. And that's from a funding and from a money perspective, I think why a lot more funding, a lot more money goes to longevity and aging intervention than it goes to cryopreservation research. But which I think is a bit ironic, because I actually see advances in cryopreservation happening much quicker than advances in aging and longevity, because we don't need to understand every molecule of water and how it interacts with every cell and every gene. We don't need to understand that in order to develop the technologies for cryopreservation, because conceptually it's more of an engineered chemical cryoprotectant engineering problem.
So, Ole, you had a comment, or?
Yeah, but I don't want to derail the science discussion because I wanted to return to the issue of like consumer safety. So
I'm also
get back to that.
Yeah, I'm going to also bridge back to that. I think one of the interesting problems is the science aspect. We can quantify them. They are very fun for us science nerds. The cryonics consumer might be scientifically literate to some extent, but they're not going to read tables of data. And that leads to that interesting question about informed consent. How much do you need to know in order to be informed? I remember being part of a medical trial, and I turned out to be a very tricky patient because I actually understood way too much about the details. So I needed way more information than a normal person who could be told this is pretty safe and we need a blood sample. I wanted to have all the details. Now, the problem here might be we can get the science and use that, and that should be part of a package. But most people will not read that. They need some good description that is good enough. And what good enough is here is a really tricky question.
So, Ola.
Yeah, that is tricky. But I have a suggestion. it's very useful across many areas to have best practice guidelines that are made either by an independent organization or an umbrella organization that says something about, some guidelines, some criteria that need to be met in order for this to be safe, to be a responsible thing to do. So I think there is quite a lot of power that lies in making guidelines with specific criteria, because then others can say that we meet the criteria set by this organization for how it should be done. And they're the ones setting, they're not us. We're not the ones setting the criteria. We're setting them and we're meeting them. So having some independent, science or medicine-driven organization that sets criteria for what it takes for cryonics practice to be responsible. I think that's an important thing to do, or at least that's a suggestion that I think it might be worth considering.
And that's also an excellent pivot to the last question, namely institutional responsibility. Francesca, do you see, for instance, the European Cryonics Association in Brussels? Could that be feasible?
I mean, yes, could be feasible. Obviously, I'm not an expert in the legislation and how these things work and what kind of challenge this kind of organization. But I think that having like organizations and people who talk about these things and think about these things like really helps, because you also create more pressure on institutions that can actually change legislations and make real changes in how the society is structured and how the legislation is structured. Like if you don't have this kind of organization, then like this is like it's a topic which is considered by most people outside our small group like science fiction in the best scenario and a scam in the worst scenario. So I think that cryonics really has a bad reputation, but I think big part of our job is just or this organization is to just make it look less weird, like and I think there is some progress in that respect. When I wrote a book on cryonics that came out in 2018, I think the attitude towards cryonic was even worse than it is now. But then there has been some changes. So there are, but it's a slow changes, and we should try to get that, because that's how it usually progresses from organizations to institutions. I don't know if I fully answered your questions, but yeah.
Well, it's a good start, Francesca. Anyone else that wants to comment on institutional responsibility and cryonics? James?
Comment all day, and I'm from a far away, so I guess I get a minute. I think both of you make great points, by the way. And I was brought in I'm not a scientist, right? Obviously, I've said this many times because they get mad at me. I was brought in by the board to destigmatize, Francesca, cryonics. And I think it was stigmatized because I think the messaging was very poor. All right. I think that many of the people, including us really in this room, or a small handful of the public really, people felt they wanted to be privy to some inside knowledge and be special because they were so smart and they adopted this. Well, then you've alienated 90% of the population if you're in the 1% of education and intelligence. Don't do that. And as a lawyer, I was trained to go to, in the US, unfortunately, an average 8th grade educated jury and convince them of complex things sometimes, technical things. So my messaging, which I took a lot of crap for when I started, by the way, I had a lot of critics, was to eat the elephant. Talk about kidneys. Don't talk about becoming a superhero and revival. Don't talk about it because you alienate. Now, we can talk about it in this room because we have advanced scientific and philosophical knowledge and things like that. So to destigmatize something, you have to make it relatable. And to Anders' point, you have to make it personal. If you need a kidney, you bet your ass you would take a cryopreserved one, right? Talk about it that way, because that makes it real. That makes it tangible. And I know this not because of me, but social psychologists did studies in the 70s on organ transplant donations that I read about. National Institute of Health paid $50 million for this stuff. I just lifted it. Okay. And it's working. And proof it's working, I leave here to go to Colorado tomorrow morning at 7 in the morning to speak in front of 5,000 members of the general public at a conference we now sponsor. It's an event. And they don't know what Alcor is. They don't know what cryopreservation is. But we talk to them about it and say, hey, this is organ banking. Because, by the way, legally, the brain is defined as an organ. See what I'm doing? See what I'm doing?
Mm-hmm.
It meets the legal definition. It's the aspirational goal. All right. Communication, I'm good at that. That's what I do. To your point, real quick, I agree with you. Here's the problem. If you get a governing body that you're talking about that's supposedly independent, you know who's contacting me about being on that governing body to control things? For profits. And the ultra wealthy, I assure you, you don't want a singular ultra wealthy people I know of, to control this exclusively, because then they control access and they want to.
So that might be the role for the public organizations to somewhat ensure that body can keep standards in the public interest.
And of course, when you talk about this in the way James suggested, you have to avoid medical jargon. That's a challenge for medics. That's a challenge for scientists.
Yeah, you're trying to sound so smart. You're alienating your audience. And by the way, for the record, for the first time ever, Alcor's created a certification process now, because we do see poor cryopreservations in the for-profits that are starting up and things like that. They don't use the same quality of chemicals, because you'll lose money. You can't do this on a for-profit. You will lose money. Don't enter the space. Okay, just trust me on a for-profit. But we've now created DART certification. It's very difficult. That's to recover people, and you have to do things a certain way. And we saw right now, there's nobody else who has the experience. We have 250 bodies. Nobody else has anywhere close to it. That's my challenge, is finding true arbiters, not self-interested with bad motives.
That sounds like a big challenge.
I like the Swedes. I trust the Swedes.
We have comment.
Well, it seems then that this should be an initiative from those of us who are academics, because we can then sign off on what guidelines are both feasible and responsible. So it seems that you're saying that if someone just starts an organization, there will be this equivalent of regulatory capture, where whoever wants to enter this space will then, whether it's billionaires, whether it's pro profit cryonics providers or whoever, if we're going to have some kind of governing body or some institution or body that publicly publicizes a set of guidelines for what is responsible cryonics, wouldn't that then have to be academics?
You want to have a mixture.
Right?
Just academics would be a disaster. Right. You want a bunch of lawyers and people who understand institutions there. And then you want some practitioners. You want to have a right kind of mixture. But the body itself need to be under the umbrella of some organization or have some legitimacy coming from somewhere. And there are various ways you can get these kind of organizations. Sometimes there are volunteer organizations that get a good reputation or develop into their own quasi-governance bodies, like the International Committee of the Red Cross. The Lloyd's of London is private, but also acts as a quasi-regulator, and because of certain game theoretical equilibria, actually manage that insurance market well. So I think we can probably find examples of this. This is totally doable. It happens all the time. It can be done more or less skillfully and might require a fair bit of work. But I do think that it can work. It could be, of course, that the government does it, or a National Academy of Science. It could be almost anywhere. But you want a guarantor that sometimes might say, okay, now you're gotten captured here and you're not doing your job. You're out. We need to redo this. That's necessary. Hopefully, it doesn't have to happen very often or at all. But you want to have a surrounding powerful organization that keeps a loose eye on it.
That sounds like a very good ending point
Well,
for
hold
the
on.
next
I have to say, I'm sorry, you go all day. But Alcor, to address this, we're actually seeking certification for organ procurement.
Okay.
The independent organ procurement organization as a starting point, because I don't know that one that applies to Cryonics can be created today without perverse incentives.
Okay.
I can explain that in detail later.
James, we have to move on. Namely, that I want to thank the panel for this quite interesting talk and moving forward. And to conclude, I'd like to invite Patrick Linden to offer a closing synthesis. Patrick is at the Geneva Longevity College lecturer and famous for the book, the philosophical book, Against Death.
Thank you very much. I made notes and I learned a lot already. So I will try to incorporate what I learned in my comments. So one thing is, yes, there is a problem that you can't get any good customer reviews for cryonics. And I spoke with one of the CEOs of a cryonics business, Emil Kentsiora from Tomorrow Bio, about this. And he is working to set up a third party that can validate the different organizations to make sure that they are following scientific procedures. And so that would be a way perhaps to get some customer protection to that point. Yes, so I wrote a book called The Case Against Death because life is good and death is bad. And it's bad for many reasons, but one of the big reasons is that it has an enormous opportunity cost. All those things you can't do when you are dead, right? And so when I heard about cryonics about 10 years ago, I thought that, yes, there are many ways, and this looks like a good way, especially since we're all getting a little bit worried as we get older that the promised advances in radical life extension are not coming as fast as we hope. And so cryonics is a safety net. Indeed, it's a safety net that some people within the longevity movement is a bit afraid of, because they say, if we have the safety net, maybe we're not going to go all in on the technology that can prolong our lives. This is kind of a second best, is to be frozen with 196 degrees minus in this ambulance towards the fountain of youth. Yeah, ambulance to the fountain of youth. So I think a big question is, people have heard about this cryonics. I've heard about it for 10 to 15 years, but most people, even the general public, have heard about this. In some studies, 50%, in other studies, 70%. And a lot of people actually are interested, like 20% or so. But how many sign up? So far, after since 1967, the first, we have about, and I'm sure you can correct me on this, but about 600, 700, 800, 900. Not who are cryopreserved. Yeah, exactly. Who actually are cryopreserved, and then we have maybe 5,000 or so that signed up. Okay, that's very, very, very little. It's very, very little when you think about how good the argument, the kind of basic argument for cryopreservation is. What do you have to lose? Now, if you're certain that you go to paradise, then it's perhaps not as pressing, as urgent. But if you're not absolutely 100% certain, then if there is even a small chance that you will wake up in a world that's technologically advanced enough, so it's probably a interesting, at least, future that you're going to wake up to, right? Or it's all gone. Everything that you enjoy in life is not accessible to you anymore because you are perhaps cremated or you are buried. It's over, right? So on the one hand, so what is the price? Some money, but as we heard, it is affordable to most middle-class people now. And I think that was a great point by Professor Hermeren, that when you come into Swedish context, we have a kind of egalitarian ethos. We don't think the thickness of the wallet, as you put it, should determine how healthy we are and how long we live and what access we have to healthcare, etc. Right? But if it comes to Sweden, then we also have an opportunity to scale it, because right now this is provided like a boutique service, right? And this is why it costs relative large amount. Although if you break it down, and I spoke with Emil Kensior, and maybe you can confirm this. If you break it down per day, it will cost about $5-6 in your life insurance. Okay, and I checked, that's about today what it costs to be a smoker. So then you can make, a lot of people then can make a choice here. And it's certainly less than it costs to have a dog in New York, I can say from personal experience. So priorities, right? Priorities. So, and so I looked at myself too, and I said, wait, I've studied this. I think it's a fantastic idea, and I'm not signed up. And I also felt guilty because I also didn't persuade my father to sign up, and I haven't persuaded my mother to sign up. And I might be making, we all who have not signed up, I think we have, if we are academics, we have, and I think this is a great point that Anders made, we have considered it theoretically from a distance, right? With a coffee in hand, right? Oh, argument works out. Yes, great, right? But we haven't really felt the urgency. And I think it's because even as academic, we are human beings. And death and the future, both, we want to see them a bit hazy. We don't want to see them too clearly. We don't want to confront them directly. It's a very different thing, you say, if you lay in the hospital bed and now you get these options, Cryonics or not. But it's as if we can't project ourselves into that situation now, right? Now, there are also other reasons for this hesitancy to act, even when you are, quote unquote, interested, like so many people are. And this goes for almost all of this kind of radical life extension, that there's a lot of people who are interested and hypothetically would want this, etc. But from experience, again, it's very hard to get more than a handful of people to show up to demonstrate for more money to these projects. So no one wants to do anything about it, right? They might be persuaded that, yes, perhaps it can be all right to live beyond the natural lifespan, but then the next step of actually doing something can be very hard, right? So even at the conference discussing radical life extension, a lot of people will not be signed up to Cryonics, who will also be able to defend it theoretically, right? Now, so I wasn't actually going to talk so much about this point, but let me just say, there is an argument against the argument that you have very little to lose. And it's an argument that actually made one of the people, a philosopher that I discussed this topic with, to say, this scares me. And it's exactly a scenario, I don't know who brought, James, I don't know who brought this up, but it is, you wake up, you're in the dystopian, the catastrophic scenario. You wake up, you have no control. Either you are captured in a computer forever, and then there's no turn off button that you can access, right? Or you're in a biological wake up form, right? And you're being experimented on or tortured by mad scientists, right? So my reaction was, well, I could be kidnapped tomorrow, right? Put in a van and put in someone's complete control. And still, I make plans. I want to wake up tomorrow. I take the chance. I take the risk, right? So that's one way to answer that question. Of course, this philosopher might say, well, yeah, but being captured inside a supercomputer and it's a different thing. And then you have to say, well, how likely is that, and what's the alternative? And since I'm defending the view that death is probably worse than we think, and I'm not talking about hell, I'm talking about even, I'm talking if there is nothing, then that nothingness isn't good for you now when you're alive to enter into. And so that's alternative. So then you have to look at how probable do you think the catastrophic scenario, the trap that you wake up to, right? How likely is that? And I think there's a lot of contingent facts that would point to that it's not particularly likely that a society that has evolved to the degree that it has the technology to wake you up would do it with the sole purpose of torturing you in some way, right? So that's an argument. All right. So the concept of death came up several times, and I think what's very important here is that whatever we decide the concept of death is going to be in a certain context, it doesn't prevent people who could be living from living. Because there's a lot of ambiguity here, and to talk about like what is death in its essence, it's a difficult philosophical question. So there are different ways that we understand death. We have clinical death, we have legal death, we have information theoretical death, which is the death concept that Cryonics operates with. And then we have what you could say the everyday concept of death. And so if we look at the everyday concept of death, it's actually ambiguous between death as being absolutely final and death as something that you can come back from. So in Christianity, right, we understand death as something that you can come back from, right? In fact, interestingly, we see death as something that is irreversible until Judgment Day, when it's reversed. And that's very similar to the concept we have when we think of legally dead, irreversible, until science reverses it in the future. So should we then change the notion, the legal notion? I think talking with Emil Cansiora and those who are involved in cryo, they're quite happy with the way things are now. And it was very good, the point that you don't want to introduce extra weirdness when you talk about cryonics. You don't want to challenge too many things at the same time. So to say, now we're all going to change a concept of death because, this is a more truthful or correct way of looking at it. I don't think that's necessary. And Emil said, no, this is good. The patient is dead. He's an anatomical donation. That gives us a certain amount of freedom that perhaps would be difficult to have if this person was still regarded as an alive patient in a coma, etc. But however we do this, the main point is that we don't prevent people who could be living from living, right? But there's going to be pragmatic decisions around this, right? As there was the example you gave, so Sweden changed the definition to brain dead 1988, right? Before that, it was about heart and circulation. Now, why? Well, because of new technology, the defibrillators, and also ideas of being able to rescue organs for organ transplants, etc. These were pragmatic decisions, right? Okay, so back to the idea of why people are still so hesitant. Well, people already, and I think this explains a lot of the hesitancy, we already have a model for handling death, right? At some point in our life, we recognize that we are going to die one day, and then we find a model. So it can be a religious model. We say, death is not real, it's a continuation. or it can be a materialist Epicurean model. We say death is real, but it can't harm us because when we are dead, we can't feel anything, right? So we'll already have a story, and we're already pleased with that. We are calm. We can put death away. We don't have to think about it. And then here comes cryonics, and we have to think about it again. And it's disruptive, and it creates resistance. And we try to come up with reasons for why it's not a good idea, right? It will turn the world into a mausoleum. There are going to be just these billions of dead people, and these dead people are still going to own property, and this just doesn't work on a social scale, for example, right? You will come up with various reasons because this idea of cryonics is threatening, right? It's threatening. Now, but what about, and this is a point that Moran, I'm circling back to a point made about the social responsibility. So when I spoke to a McKenzie about, I said, if you could will the most cryo-friendly laws or system, institutional system, how would it look? And he said, I mostly just want no one to make a law against it, right? I don't need too many radical changes, right? Just don't stand in the way of cryonics. Of course, it would be great with some investment in the science, right? That's always good. But it's important not to stand in the way of it. Now, but I was thinking, and other philosophers have been thinking, what if, and I think it all depends very much about how probable we think it's going to be that we wake up in a good world. Now, if we think that this is a 50-50, that you will be reanimated into a good life and live a long life in that hereafter in the future, right? If we think it's 50-50, what does that mean for society? I think, for example, we would say that it should be perhaps mandatory, at least for children who die early, to enter cryonics. Because we have, of course, this discussion that we say that parents, legal guardians, are not allowed to prevent life-saving treatments for children, right? But this here is, of course, a life-saving treatment par excellence, right? We don't even know how much life it could be. We could gain 100 years, right? Or 200 years, or live indefinitely. We don't know, but it's a great upside. And if we know that there's such a good chance that it's going to work, should parents be allowed to say no to cryo? And I know now you get scared because we don't want to be perhaps a maximalist about certain claims. In fact, there's also then an argument for, as a society, to invest in it, because we like to invest and even be a bit paternalistic about things that can save people's lives, like seatbelts, wearing seatbelts, for example, right? So these are big changes. But interestingly, that takes off once we feel certain that this works, more certain that this works. Now, finally, I think, right? So a final point is this, that there is a pessimistic fear that you'll wake up to dystopia, right? Now, the thing is, it creates for everyone who signed up to cryonics a great reason to make this world better, right? If you signed up to cryonics, you want to advance science, stability of society, endurance of institutions, all of these good things. So there could be kind of moral force also in cryonics. And finally, of course, the biggest threat to cryonics may not be that the technology won't work out, but for example, that we'll enter a nuclear war or something like that. So that's another thing someone who cares about the future or in cryonics should worry about.
Thank you. Well, I have two questions. One very long term, obviously, and one little shorter term. The first one is, how do you see how do you view procreation and population of the world in this context? That's the first question. The second one, I think you, at least Patrick, has touched on it, is how does the development of cryonics tie in with the lightning fast development of artificial intelligence? Because, I mean, some people obviously believe that it can become conscious itself. So those are the two questions.
Good. Who would like to answer? Anders?
So the population issue comes up quite a lot in the discussion of life extension. But of course, while it's not an enormous problem even in life extension given current demographic trends, it's even less so for cryonics, simply because so few people are signed up. If everybody in the world were signed up and we accumulated more and more frozen people, there would perhaps be a population problem. But I don't see that as particularly likely given how it currently works. The other question, for me, artificial intelligence is really interesting because it seems like it's going to automate a lot of research. And as a researcher, that's kind of scary for me, but it's probably a good thing for the rest of humanity because you can actually do quite a lot of the lab work using AI. You can use AI to test out new theories. We can probably actually accelerate quite a lot of scientific development. Now, I'm also working a lot on the existential risk side, so this is deeply scary to me for that reason. But generally, I think advanced AI might speed up the arrival of a future. And that's good news for cryonics. It might be a really weird future we end up in, but I think that's very good. Of course, if it's also conscious, we might need to give moral consideration to it, but that's a bit of a separate issue.
So this is the question for James, I guess. If I understood everything right, you want to establish Alcor in Sweden and Germany. Wait,
there's a model. It's a logistics model. It has to do with time to temperature. You're on left, but Sweden is the endpoint.
Okay.
Ideally,
so
and
why
Germany is
Sweden?
a logistic. Honestly, it's the people. I mean, the people are serious people, but you're also open-minded, particularly for technology. The culture is important. You know, many new technologies, by the way, are tested in Japan because it's homogeneous culture, as it were, and it's an island, and there's reasons for that. But Sweden, I think, and then also geography. Frankly, this is Anders' big thing. There has to do with things with seismic activity, background radiation, nuclear. You mentioned the nuclear thing. There's places in Sweden that land wars in Europe haven't touched for 500 years. So those are all components. And also, if I have to live somewhere, I'd like to live in Stockholm. I'll probably have to tether this thing for a few years to begin with. There's been a lot of analysis, a ton, and this is a really good jumping point from Frankfurt. So Germany is about Frankfurt, the airport. And London's a mess. You can't get into or out of London in any reasonable amount of time. So an enormous amount of work has been put into it. And Sweden, I think, is the right place. But again, I don't just want to come in and set something up. I want to talk to all of you first. And I want to understand the cultural sensitivities. I want to make nice with everybody. Make sure, we come in peace.
Further questions?
Yes, thank you very much. My name is Linus Peterson. I'm a scientist, engineer, and author on the subject. I love your point, Patrick, that why are we all here? Well, life is good, death is bad. This is a disaster. I mean, we want to keep on living, and it's sort of. I've been talking about this for 25 years. I don't get why this is so hard. I think Patrick, you are on the right track here in terms of when we challenge people's model of death, we sort of make them uncomfortable and they try to rationalize why death and suffering and sickness is actually good. And that's probably the reason. But my question relates to feasibility. So I work in the pharmaceutical industry trying to develop drugs targeting aging. And I think the feasibility point here is super important. And, I know most of the scientists within this field. And I think the point here is that it is possible both to make cryonics happen, but also to develop life-extending therapies, targeting aging, in the sense that we're not breaking the laws of physics. We have examples in the animal kingdom of animals who have, in practice, probably indefinite lifespans. So, I mean, those points should convince people, right? Now, as Joar said, I'll be very brief. We don't have a complete scientific understanding of what aging is, yes. But I think like we must emphasize that this is possible. We're not trying to travel faster than the speed of light. And I think this is a very crucial point to get across to the general public. Yeah, and that is like, so the question to the panel is, when communicating to the public, do you think feasibility is an important point? And what's the most important point to convince the public? Sorry, Valdemar.
So, anyone on the panel that's thinking about the feasibility and how it could be? Ola?
Well, regarding the communication of feasibility, I'm sometimes asked by journalists and colleagues, do you think this will work? And I say, no, I don't think it will work. I think it's more likely than not that it will not work. And that's, I found, kind of a disarming response, where it's not this super optimistic hope. So just saying that, is it most likely that it will work? If you just say, no, that's probably not most likely, that, at least to me, has seemed to be a good way to handle the question of feasibility, just on a communications level.
Okay.
Yeah. I have a question about words and definitions. Because it seems to me that the exchange between James and Minerva, one of the things that came out was that it can matter a lot how you describe something and what you call it, right? So this is a question about, whether we should call a certain procedure cryocoma or cryoeuthanasia. So one thing that you said, James, is that in some cases where Alcor is involved, there's a patient who first meets the criteria for the legal definition of death, or meets some certain legal criteria for death, and there's a doctor there to make that judgment, and then only then do you get involved, right? Okay. Good. All cases. So now my question is about the cryocoma case, which I take it as a different thing. Is that a procedure, the one that you want to call cryocoma, where the patient skips those criteria, that is, they do not meet whatever the legal criteria of death are?
Well, it could be, and
if it is, then you have an argument for calling it, at least in some contexts, the U.S. context anyway, cryocoma rather than cryoeuthanasia, because you can say, remember, this is just about what you can say. It's about words.
Right. Sure.
You can say, here's a case where these criteria that we usually rely on, to determine whether someone is legally dead or not, have not been met. And therefore, it's actually not a case of killing someone.
Right. No, I think you're right.
It's
right,
rather a case. So insofar as words and criteria and definitions matter, right, that's a lever you could potentially pull.
To your point about talking
to offer, for your preferred label.
No, and that gets deep, and it gets deeper than I think most people initially you can communicate with. And I want to say something that's really important to your point on death. The fear here is, what if this works? Understand, I deal with the public more than anybody else on this topic in communicating with them. The fear is, what if it works? And then what's the future, and why? And some of our military folks on our DART, we have special forces that work with us now, and actually working with German, Swedish, but a lot of them say, I don't want to do this even if it does work, because of their lives, and they want to be with their friends that have passed and what have you. And so I think you have to allow for those determinations individually. That's why I'm not worried about population control. You'll actually find probably a significant amount of the population that says, you know what, I don't want to live longer beyond what is a natural lifespan. And I encounter that. I'm the front of this battlefield. So to your point, I think it's actually, oh my God, what if this works?
And we're actually at 12 o'clock. I would like to say thank you to all the speakers, and thank you to the audience. And it has been a very quite interesting morning, and I hope we will only have seen the beginning of the cryonics discussion about cryonics policy and the institutions needed for it. Thank you very much.